The tray slipped first, then the glass shattered against the polished marble floor, sharp and sudden, like something breaking that could never be put back together, and that was the exact moment Ethan Cole stopped breathing, because standing 3 feet in front of him, wearing a wrinkled black apron and a forced professional smile, was the one woman he had erased from his life 3 years ago, Lily Carter, his ex-wife, the woman he once promised forever, now balancing a tray of drinks like she didn't used to belong to a world far above this, and for a second the noise of the restaurant disappeared, the low hum of conversations, the clink of silverware, the soft jazz floating through hidden speakers, all of it faded into a dull silence, as his eyes dropped instinctively not to her face but lower, to the unmistakable curve beneath her uniform, and something inside his chest tightened, not with anger, not yet, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition, confusion, and a flicker of something he refused to name. Stay with me, because what happened next would be talked about by people who weren't even in that room, people who would later say it was the night a man finally saw the cost of his own choices. Lily didn't look at him, not at first. She moved with careful precision, placing a glass of red wine in front of a couple seated nearby, her hands steady but just barely, as if every movement had been practiced to hide the tremor underneath, and Ethan noticed everything: the small crease in her shoes, the faint exhaustion in her posture, the way she kept her shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make herself invisible in a place designed to be seen and admired. This was not the woman he remembered. This was not the woman who used to walk beside him in tailored dresses under crystal chandeliers, laughing softly while investors watched with admiration, and yet there she was, reduced in his mind to something he couldn't quite process, and that confusion twisted quickly into something sharper. Something colder, because in Ethan Cole's world things didn't just fall apart without reason, and if she was here like this, then clearly she had failed in some way that made sense to him. At least that's what he told himself to steady the uncomfortable feeling rising in his chest. He took a slow step forward, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the floor, and finally said her name, not loudly, not softly, but with the kind of certainty that once controlled entire boardrooms. Lily. The name landed between them like a weight, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, her hand froze midair before she turned her head and met his eyes, and there it was, not shock, not relief, not even anger, just a quiet, measured distance, like she was looking at a stranger who happened to know her past, and nothing more. You should leave, she said, her voice calm, almost detached, the kind of calm that doesn't invite questions. But Ethan didn't move, because something about that sentence, something about the way she said it, without fear, without hesitation, without even a hint of pleading, made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the air itself had shifted, and around them a few heads began to turn, subtle at first, but noticeable enough. Phones lowering, conversations pausing, curiosity building, because people always sense when something real is about to happen. And Ethan, standing there in a tailored suit worth more than most monthly rents, facing a pregnant waitress who refused to acknowledge his power, looked less like control and more like the beginning of something he didn't understand yet, and that was the part he couldn't accept. Not now, not ever, because men like him don't lose control, they redefine it, or so he believed until this moment proved otherwise. The silence between them did not break, it stretched thin like glass under pressure, and Ethan felt it in a way he could not explain, because Lily was supposed to react differently. She was supposed to look surprised, maybe emotional, maybe even weak, but instead she stood there, steady, composed, like someone who had already lived through the worst, and had nothing left to prove, and that unsettled him more than anything. You should leave, she repeated, this time her voice slightly firmer, not louder, just certain, and that certainty landed heavier than any raised voice ever could. Ethan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. Leave, he echoed, as if testing the word, like it did not belong in his vocabulary. His gaze flickered again to her stomach, then back to her face, and something darker crept into his expression, something defensive, something that needed control to return to its place. I think you are the one who should explain, he said, his tone lowering into the kind he used in negotiations when he expected compliance. But Lily did not respond immediately. She simply reached for another glass from her tray, adjusted it slightly, and placed it down on a nearby table for a waiting customer who pretended not to listen but had not taken their eyes off the scene for the past 30 seconds, and now more people were watching, subtle glances turning into open attention, because tension like this does not stay hidden in a room full of strangers. And phones began to shift, not raised yet but ready, and Ethan noticed it, the shift in atmosphere, the way control was no longer entirely his, and that realization tightened something in his chest. I asked you something, he said again, a little sharper this time, not loud enough to cause a scene but enough to draw a line. And finally Lily looked directly at him fully this time, no hesitation, no avoidance, just a calm, steady gaze that held none of the softness he remembered, and that absence hit harder than anything she could have said. "There is nothing to explain," she replied quietly, and for a second that answer did not register because it was too simple, too final. Nothing to explain, as if the years they had shared, the life they built, the way he had walked away from it all meant nothing in this moment, and Ethan felt something flicker behind his composure, irritation rising quickly to cover whatever else was underneath. "Nothing," he repeated, stepping closer, lowering his voice further. "You disappear, you end up here, and now you are telling me there is nothing to explain," and he stopped just short of finishing the thought, but his eyes said the rest, his assumptions clear written across his face, and Lily saw it. She saw exactly what he was implying, and something almost like a faint, tired smile touched her lips, not amused, not bitter, just understanding in a way that felt final. "You already decided your version a long time ago," she said, and that sentence landed differently, not like an accusation, not like anger, but like a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been settled long before tonight, and Ethan felt it because it was true. He had decided, he had signed papers, transferred accounts, closed doors, and walked away with a certainty that had never been questioned until now, and that certainty was beginning to crack, not loudly, not visibly, but enough for him to feel it beneath the surface, like something shifting where it should not, and before he could respond, before he could reassert the version of reality he was more comfortable with, a voice from behind them cut through the moment, calm, professional, but carrying just enough authority to change the air. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" And Lily did not turn immediately. She did not need to, because she recognized that voice instantly, and for the first time since Ethan had walked in, something changed in her posture. Not fear, not relief, just a subtle release, like a weight she had been holding was no longer hers alone to carry, and Ethan turned instead, his attention shifting to the man approaching them, unaware that whatever control he thought he was about to regain was already slipping further out of his hands. The man who stepped forward did not raise his voice, and he did not rush, yet the space around him shifted in a way that made people instinctively move aside, as if authority did not need to announce itself to be recognized. He was dressed simply, a dark tailored suit, no tie, but everything about him was precise, controlled, intentional, and when his eyes moved from Ethan to Lily there was a brief moment of assessment, not curiosity, not confusion, just confirmation, like he already understood more than what was visible. "There is no problem," Lily said before Ethan could answer, her tone even, steady, but this time there was something else beneath it, something grounded, and the man gave a small nod as if that was enough, but he did not leave. Instead he remained exactly where he was, his presence quiet yet immovable, and Ethan noticed that immediately. "Who are you?" Ethan asked the question sharper than necessary, because something about this man unsettled him in a different way than Lily had. This was not emotional, this was structural, like a shift in balance he could not yet calculate. The man's expression did not change. "Daniel Reeves," he said simply, and then after a brief pause he added, "I represent Lily Carter," and that single sentence landed heavier than anything that had been said so far. "Represent, not friend, not coworker, not manager, represent," and Ethan felt the word settle in his mind like a piece of a puzzle that did not fit the version of reality he had built, because Lily Carter was not supposed to have representation, she was not supposed to have leverage, she was not supposed to stand here in a worn uniform and still have something he could not immediately dismiss. Represent her for what? Ethan asked, though the edge in his voice had softened slightly, not out of respect but out of calculation, because now he was listening differently, now he was measuring. Lily did not answer, she did not need to. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that draws attention without demanding it, and from that pocket he pulled out a thin envelope, not thick, not dramatic, just clean, official looking, and he held it for a moment without handing it over yet, as if giving Ethan time to understand that whatever was inside it mattered more than anything that had been said so far. "You should not be having this conversation here," Daniel said calmly, his eyes meeting Ethan's directly, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. "But since you chose to approach her, I will make this simple." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. The restaurant noise had not returned. People were still watching, pretending not to, but clearly waiting, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not yet, but a lack of control that he could not immediately correct. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the envelope, and Daniel did not answer right away. Instead he looked at Lily briefly, and she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible but enough, and only then did Daniel extend the envelope toward Ethan, who hesitated for just a fraction of a second before taking it, because refusing would mean losing ground in front of witnesses. And that was something he would never allow. The paper inside was heavier than expected, official stamp structured, and as Ethan unfolded it his eyes moved quickly, at first scanning for context for something familiar, but then they slowed, not because he wanted them to but because the words forced them to. And the shift was immediate, subtle but real. His posture changed just slightly, his grip tightened almost imperceptibly, and something in his expression flickered, not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that arrives when a truth you never questioned suddenly stands in front of you with documentation to prove it. And behind him someone shifted in their seat, a glass clinked softly against the table, the world beginning to move again. But for Ethan Cole everything had just stopped in a way that felt far more permanent than a moment in a restaurant ever should. The paper did not shake in Ethan's hand, but something deeper did, something quieter, something that did not show itself on the surface yet, made every word on that page feel heavier than it should have been. His eyes moved again, slower this time, tracing lines he could not dismiss, legal language structured, precise, and unmistakably real, financial disclosures, amended filings, dates that aligned too closely with memories he had chosen not to revisit, and at the bottom a signature not his but connected to him in a way that made his chest tighten almost imperceptibly. "This is a mistake," he said finally, but the words lacked the certainty he was used to hearing in his own voice, and Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply watched, not with satisfaction, not with pressure, just with the calm patience of someone who knew time was no longer on Ethan's side. "It is not a mistake," Daniel replied after a moment, and his tone remained even controlled, like everything about this situation had already been calculated before Ethan had even walked into the restaurant. "You signed documents 3 years ago that declared full financial transparency during your divorce proceedings. That statement is now under review." Ethan's jaw tightened again, more visibly this time, his mind already moving faster, searching for angles, for explanations, for anything that could restore the structure he had built, but every path he reached for felt less solid than it should have been. "That is standard procedure," he said quickly, shifting his weight slightly as if grounding himself. "You cannot just reopen something that is already settled." Daniel's expression did not change. "It can be reviewed when new evidence is presented," he said, and then he paused just long enough for the words to settle before adding quietly, "and there is new evidence." The word evidence did not echo in the room, but it might as well have, because something in the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and Ethan felt it this time not as confusion, but as pressure building from a direction he had not anticipated, and slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes moved back down to the page again, scanning details he had overlooked, dates, transfers, accounts that had been structured in ways that once felt distant, technical, handled by people he trusted, people whose job was to make things efficient, clean, unquestionable, and now those same details looked different, not clean, not distant, but exposed in a way that made them impossible to ignore. "This is not relevant," he said, but softer now, less like a statement, more like something he needed to believe. Lily shifted slightly beside them, not stepping forward, not retreating, just present, and for the first time Ethan noticed something he had missed earlier, not in her expression, not in her posture, but in the way she stood there, without urgency, without fear, like someone who had already faced the outcome of this moment long before it arrived, and that realization unsettled him more than the document in his hand, because it meant she was not reacting, she was prepared. "You should not have come tonight," Daniel said quietly, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as a simple observation, and Ethan let out a breath through his nose, something between frustration and disbelief, because for the first time the situation in front of him was not something he could control with confidence, or dismiss with logic. It was something else, something that had been building without his awareness, and was now standing in front of him in the most unexpected place possible, a restaurant floor under soft lighting, surrounded by strangers who were beginning to return to their conversations, but not fully, not completely, because moments like this do not disappear, they linger just beneath the surface, waiting for whatever comes next. And Ethan, standing there holding a piece of paper that refused to fit his version of the past, realized that whatever came next was no longer his to decide. The paper lowered slowly in Ethan's hand, but not because he was finished reading, it was because something in his mind needed space, needed distance from the words that refused to fit into the version of events he had carried for years. His eyes lifted, not to Daniel, not immediately, but to Lily, and for the first time since he had spoken her name there was no assumption in his gaze, no quiet judgment, no cold calculation, just a searching confusion that felt unfamiliar even to him. "You knew about this," he said, and the question came out quieter than anything else he had said that night, almost careful, as if the answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. Lily held his gaze for a moment longer than before, not long enough to invite emotion but long enough to make sure he understood that this was not a reaction, this was a decision. I learned the truth after everything was already taken from me, she said, and her voice did not rise, it did not break, it remained steady in a way that carried more weight than anger ever could, and Ethan felt that sentence settle somewhere deeper than the legal language on the page, because it was not about documents, it was about timing, about what had been hidden, and when, and who had known, and who had chosen not to ask, and his mind moved quickly back through moments he had never questioned, meetings handled by advisors, documents presented as routine, assurances given in confident tones, everything efficient, everything clean, everything designed to move forward without friction, and now that same efficiency felt different, not like strength, but like something that had been arranged too carefully. You are saying I did not know, he said, and there was something in his voice now, something closer to defense than authority, and Daniel stepped in, not interrupting but redirecting the focus with a calm precision that felt practiced. The filings suggest that information was withheld during the settlement process, he said, and then added after a brief pause, whether you knew or not is something that will be determined through formal review. The phrase formal review did not sound threatening, it sounded inevitable, and that was worse because inevitability does not argue, it does not negotiate, it simply arrives, and Ethan felt that shift more clearly now. The structure he relied on was not collapsing, it was being examined, and that was a process he could not rush or control with presence alone. He exhaled slowly, his grip on the document loosening just slightly, and for the first time his attention returned to Lily, not as a problem to solve, not as a past to dismiss, but as a person standing directly in front of him with a reality he had not accounted for. You could have contacted me, he said, and this time the words were not sharp, they were almost searching, as if he was trying to find a version of events where he had not been completely removed from the equation. But Lily shook her head once, small, decisive, not dramatic. You made it clear there was no space for that, she replied, and there was no accusation in her tone, just a statement that felt final because it was rooted in something already lived, not something being argued now, and Ethan felt that more than anything else, not the legal implications, not the public setting, not even the attention around them, but the realization that the distance between them had not been created tonight, it had been built step by step long before this moment, and now it simply stood between them, visible, undeniable, and unmoved. And as the quiet returned around them, as conversation slowly resumed and glasses clinked again in the background, Ethan Cole stood there holding a document that questioned his past, facing a woman who no longer needed his version of the truth, and for the first time in a very long time he was not the one defining what came next. The moment did not end, it lingered, stretching longer than it should have, as if the room itself was waiting for Ethan to do something, to say something that would restore the balance he had always relied on. But nothing came immediately, because for the first time in years his instincts did not lead him forward. They paused, and in that pause something uncomfortable began to surface, not fear, not yet, but awareness, and awareness in a man like Ethan Cole was far more dangerous than any confrontation, because it meant the narrative he had built so carefully was no longer stable. You should go, Daniel said quietly, not as a dismissal but as a boundary, and this time it was not Lily speaking, it was someone else setting the terms, and Ethan noticed that shift clearly because it meant this was no longer a personal exchange, it had moved into something structured, something defined, and he was no longer leading it. His eyes moved once more to Lily, and this time they did not search for weakness, they searched for confirmation, for something he could still recognize from the past. But what he found instead was distance, not cold, not hostile, just complete, like a door that had already been closed long before he arrived, and that realization settled deeper than anything written on the paper in his hand. What about the child, he asked suddenly. And the question came out before he could filter it, before he could shape it into something more controlled, because it was the one piece of this moment. He could not ignore, the one variable that did not fit into any version of events he had prepared for, and for the first time since the conversation began Lily did not answer immediately. She inhaled slowly, not sharply, not emotionally, just enough to mark the weight of the question, and then she met his eyes again, not with hesitation but with clarity. The child is not part of this conversation, she said, and her voice remained calm, but this time there was a line in it, unmistakable, firm, and Ethan felt it because it was not a rejection, it was a boundary, and boundaries were something he was not used to encountering without the option to negotiate. That is not your decision to make, he replied automatically, the reflex of control still present but weaker now, less certain, and Daniel stepped forward just slightly, not blocking, not confronting, just enough to shift the dynamic once more. It actually is, he said, and the calm in his voice did not change, but the meaning behind it did, because now it was not about tone, it was about position, about who held authority in this moment, and Ethan recognized that even if he did not accept it yet, you will receive formal notice regarding any relevant matters. Daniel continued, and until then I strongly suggest you do not approach her. Again the words were measured, precise, not threatening but final, and Ethan stood there for a second longer than necessary, not because he did not understand but because he was not used to stepping back without resolution, without the last word, without control, and yet something in the situation made it clear that pushing further would not restore anything, it would only expose more, and exposure was not something he could manage in a room full of witnesses, even if they pretended not to be watching. He exhaled once more, slower this time, his fingers tightening briefly around the document before relaxing again. And then without another word he folded it carefully, not crumpling, not rushing, just controlled, deliberate, like everything he did, and he handed it back to Daniel, who accepted it without comment. The space between them remained unchanged, but the meaning of it had shifted completely, because now it was no longer a distance Ethan could cross, it was one he had been placed outside of, and as he turned slightly, stepping back for the first time since he had approached her, the sound of the restaurant returned, not all at once but gradually, voices overlapping, glasses clinking, movement resuming, as if the moment had passed, but beneath that surface something remained, something unresolved, something that would not stay contained within this room, and Ethan Cole, walking away with measured steps, felt it following him, not loudly, not visibly, but persistently, like a truth that does not need to chase because it knows it will be faced eventually. The door closed behind him with a soft click that should have meant nothing, just another customer leaving, just another night continuing, but Ethan did not move past the entrance, not yet, because something in his chest refused to settle. The cool night air outside felt sharper than it should have, the city lights reflecting off polished cars passing by in steady motion, everything normal, everything exactly as it had always been, and yet none of it felt the same, because for the first time in years Ethan Cole stepped into a world that was not responding to him the way it always had. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, a familiar interruption, a notification, an email, something that would normally pull his attention instantly, but he ignored it, his mind still inside that restaurant, replaying not the words, not the legal language, but the way Lily had looked at him, not angry, not broken, not even distant in the way he expected, but resolved, and that was something he could not easily categorize. Resolved meant she had moved forward without him, without needing anything from him, without waiting for any explanation or acknowledgement. And that realization pressed heavier than anything Daniel had said. He reached for his phone, finally unlocking it with a practiced motion, and the screen lit up with the usual stream of updates, financial alerts, meeting confirmations, a reminder about a call scheduled in less than 30 minutes, everything structured, everything controlled, everything exactly how his life had always functioned. But now there was something else buried between those notifications, an email flag, high priority from a legal firm he recognized immediately, not his, not one he worked with, but one he had seen before in passing, the kind that handled complex disputes, high-level cases, situations that did not resolve quietly, and his thumb hovered for a fraction of a second before opening it, not because he hesitated but because something in him already understood that whatever was inside would not be simple. The message was brief, direct, and structured, outlining the initiation of a formal review, referencing discrepancies in previously submitted disclosures and requesting documentation within a specified time frame measured in days, not weeks, not months, days. And Ethan read it once, then again, slower, the words precise, leaving no room for interpretation, and as he reached the end his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in recognition, because this was not a warning, it was a process already in motion, and processes like this did not begin without preparation, did not move without evidence, did not stop because someone asked them to. And for the first time that night the reality of what Daniel had said settled fully, not as a possibility, not as something that could be managed quietly, but as something that would unfold regardless of his position, his influence, or his certainty. He lowered the phone slowly, his gaze lifting toward the reflection in the glass window beside the restaurant, and for a moment he saw himself clearly, tailored suit, composed posture, controlled expression, the same man who had walked into that room expecting to define the moment, and yet something in that reflection felt incomplete, not broken, not defeated, just altered in a way that had not been there before. And behind that reflection, through the glass, he could still see the interior of the restaurant, blurred by light and movement, but enough to recognize a figure moving between tables, steady, focused, continuing forward without pause. And Ethan watched for a second longer than necessary, not because he expected her to look up, but because part of him now understood that she would not, and as he finally stepped away from the window turning toward the waiting car that had already pulled up to the curb, his movements remained controlled, measured, precise, but beneath that control something had shifted permanently, something that would not return to what it was before, because some moments do not announce themselves as turning points, they simply arrive quietly, and leave everything else to adjust around them whether you are ready or not. The car door closed with a muted thud, sealing Ethan inside a space that had always felt like control. Leather seats, soft lighting, the faint scent of cologne and polished wood, everything familiar, everything designed to insulate him from the outside world, and yet tonight that insulation felt thinner, like something had followed him in without permission. He leaned back slightly, not fully relaxing, just enough to create distance between himself and the moment that refused to fade, replaying not in fragments, but in clarity. Lily's voice steady, Daniel's presence unshaken, the document precise and undeniable, and beneath all of that something else, something he had not expected, the absence of reaction from the one person he thought he understood best. His driver glanced at him briefly through the rearview mirror, waiting for direction, but Ethan did not speak immediately, because for the first time the next step was not obvious, not scheduled, not already decided, and that hesitation lingered longer than it should have, until finally he gave a quiet address, not his office, not his penthouse, but somewhere else, a place he had not visited in months, his main corporate building, where everything still functioned according to the systems he had built, because if there was one thing Ethan Cole trusted, it was structure, and right now he needed to be inside it. The city moved past the window in streaks of light red signals, reflections on wet pavement, silhouettes of people walking with purpose or without it, all blending into something distant. As his mind shifted from memory to calculation, timelines began forming automatically, dates from the document aligning with transactions he vaguely remembered, authorizations he had signed without question, because that was how his world worked, delegation, efficiency, trust in the people he had chosen, and now that trust was being examined, not emotionally, not personally, but procedurally. And that distinction mattered, because procedure did not care about intention, it only cared about facts, and facts, when arranged correctly, had a way of reshaping everything. The car slowed, then stopped in front of the glass tower that bore his name in quiet, understated lettering. The building stood exactly as it always had, tall, reflective, untouchable, and for a moment Ethan remained seated, looking at it, not with pride, not tonight, but with a strange detachment, as if he was seeing it from the outside for the first time, measuring not what it represented but what it concealed. He stepped out finally, his movements still precise, still controlled, the rhythm unchanged, even if the meaning behind it had shifted, and inside the lobby the familiar environment welcomed him back, polished floors, security nods, quiet acknowledgement from staff who recognized him instantly, everything functioning exactly as it should. And yet as he crossed that space something felt different, not in the building, not in the people, but in his perception of it, because now he was not just the man who owned this structure, he was also the man whose decisions inside it might soon be questioned, examined, laid out in ways he had never intended. His phone buzzed again, another message, this time from his chief financial officer, requesting immediate clarification regarding inquiries that had already begun, and Ethan stopped walking for a fraction of a second, just enough to read it fully before continuing forward, his pace unchanged but his focus sharper, because now the situation had moved beyond a single conversation in a restaurant. It had entered his world, his systems, his control, and that was where it became real. He stepped into the elevator alone, the doors closing with a quiet precision as the numbers began to rise one floor at a time, steady, inevitable, and as his reflection appeared again in the mirrored walls he looked at it differently. Not searching, not analyzing, just observing, because something in that reflection no longer matched the certainty he had carried for years. And as the elevator continued its ascent, Ethan Cole understood something that could not be reversed, not by money, not by influence, not by control. Some truths do not wait for the right setting, they arrive when they are ready, and once they do, everything built before them must answer for it, whether it was meant to or not. The elevator doors opened with a soft tone that usually signaled arrival, progress, control, but tonight it felt more like a threshold, and Ethan stepped out into a floor that had always belonged to him, the executive level, quiet, carpeted, insulated from the noise below, where decisions were made and consequences rarely reached without invitation. The lights adjusted automatically as he walked forward, recognizing his presence, the system responding to him the way it always had, and yet even that felt different, not wrong, not broken, just incomplete, like the environment was still aligned with a version of him that no longer fully existed. His office door stood closed at the end of the corridor, a simple detail, but one that carried weight, because behind it was everything he trusted, his records, his systems, his people, the structure that had never failed. him, and as he reached for the handle there was a brief pause, not hesitation exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when stepping into something that might not respond the same way it always has. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was unchanged, wide glass walls overlooking the city, a desk positioned with precision, screens dark but ready, files organized with exactness, everything in place, everything controlled. And yet the first thing he noticed was not the space, it was the absence of noise, no background conversation, no subtle activity, just silence. The kind that makes every movement more deliberate, and Ethan crossed the room, setting his phone down on the desk, not carefully, not carelessly, just automatically, and the screen lit again. Another message, this time from legal, internal not external, requesting immediate review of several past transactions flagged for irregularities. The word irregularities stood out not because of what it meant, but because of where it appeared inside his own system, his own structure, and that was something new. He tapped the screen, opening the report, and lines of data appeared, organized, clean, precise, but now marked, highlighted sections, dates that matched the document Daniel had handed him earlier, numbers that once blended into larger figures now isolated, examined. And as Ethan moved through the information, his expression did not change, but his focus sharpened, because this was no longer theoretical, this was internal confirmation that something had shifted within his own operation. He reached for his desk phone instead of his mobile, a deliberate choice, and dialed a direct line, one that bypassed assistants, bypassed layers, connecting him immediately to the one person responsible for oversight, his chief financial officer. The call connected on the second ring. Ethan, I was about to call you again. The voice came through, controlled but not entirely steady, and Ethan noticed that immediately, because steadiness was expected at this level. What exactly am I looking at? He asked, not raising his voice, not adding pressure, just direct. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not long but enough to signal that the answer would not be simple. We are still verifying, but the preliminary review suggests that several disclosures made during your divorce settlement may not have included all relevant accounts. The words were careful, structured, but the meaning behind them was clear enough. Incomplete, not necessarily false, not yet, but incomplete. And that distinction mattered legally, strategically, personally. It was handled by external advisors, Ethan said automatically, his tone still controlled, but now there was something else beneath it, something closer to calculation than certainty. I did not manage those filings directly. There was another pause, this one slightly longer, and when the response came it was quieter, less certain. That may be part of the issue, because if those advisors acted without full disclosure, it raises questions about oversight and responsibility. And the word responsibility did not echo, but it settled heavier than anything else, because responsibility does not transfer easily, not when signatures exist, not when systems are built to track accountability. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxing, just creating space, his eyes moving to the glass wall overlooking the city again, lights, steady movement, constant, everything continuing exactly as it should outside, while inside something fundamental was being re-examined. When will you have full clarity? He asked, and the answer came without delay. 48 hours, maybe less, and Ethan nodded once, though no one could see it. 48 hours, a defined window, a measurable timeline, something he could work with, because uncertainty becomes manageable when it is contained. But as he ended the call, placing the receiver back into its cradle with precise control, he understood something that no timeline could change. Whatever was coming had already started, and this time it was not something he could outpace, it was something that would meet him exactly where he stood. The office remained silent after the call ended, but it was no longer the kind of silence that meant control. It was the kind that carried weight, like something unseen had settled into the room and was not leaving any time soon. Ethan did not move immediately. He sat there looking at the city through the glass, not really seeing it, his mind no longer jumping ahead to solutions or outcomes, but staying in the present moment, something he rarely allowed himself to do, because the present offered no leverage, no advantage, only reality. And right now that reality was shifting in ways that did not respond to pressure or influence. His phone lit again, this time not with a message but a name, and for a brief second his eyes rested on it before he picked it up, not because he wanted to but because he needed to understand how far this had already spread. Olivia Grant. The name carried its own kind of weight, not personal, not emotional, but strategic. She was not just another contact, she was the one person who had stood beside him through negotiations, acquisitions, decisions that shaped everything he had built, and if she was calling now, it meant the situation had already moved beyond internal review. Ethan, he answered, his tone controlled as always, and on the other end there was no greeting, no small transition, just direct clarity. We need to talk now. Her voice was Steady, but there was something beneath it, not panic, not fear, but urgency, the kind that only appears when something crosses a line that cannot be ignored. I am aware, he said, and that was true, but awareness was no longer enough. That review you mentioned, it is not contained, she continued, and the words landed with precision. External inquiries have already been initiated, and there are requests coming in from parties we do not control. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, not visible to anyone else but enough for him to feel it, because this was the moment where the situation expanded beyond his systems, beyond his influence, into something larger, something public. What exactly are they looking at, he asked, and there was a pause. Not because she did not know, but because the answer required weight. Disclosures, transfers, asset allocations, specifically those tied to your divorce settlement. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in frustration, not in denial, but in recognition, because the pattern was now complete. The document, the internal report, the call from his financial officer, and now this external confirmation, all aligning into something that could no longer be dismissed as isolated or manageable. You need to come in tomorrow morning first thing, she added, and there was no suggestion in her tone, no option, just direction. We are assembling a response team and legal counsel will be present. Ethan exhaled slowly, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to reset the rhythm of his breathing. Tomorrow morning, he repeated, and the words felt heavier than a simple schedule. They felt like a marker, like something that would divide what came before from what came next. I will be there, he said, and the call ended without anything further, because there was nothing else to say, not now, not until everything that had been set in motion reached its next point. He placed the phone down again, but this time he did not look at the screen, he did not check for more messages or updates. He simply sat there in the center of a space that had always represented control, and realized that control was no longer defined by what he could manage, but by what he could face. And as the city lights continued to move outside, unchanged, steady, indifferent, Ethan Cole understood that whatever version of his life had existed before tonight had already begun to separate from him, not all at once, not visibly, but in a way that could not be reversed, because some truths do not wait for permission, they move forward on their own, and when they do, the only thing left is how you stand when they finally reach you. Morning arrived without announcement, no dramatic shift, no clear boundary between what had been and what was now unfolding, just a steady continuation of time that did not wait for clarity or comfort, and Ethan stood at the edge of it, already dressed, already composed, already moving through the motions that had defined his life for years, except now each step carried a different weight, not heavier exactly, but more precise, like every action was being measured against something unseen. The conference room was prepared before he arrived, glass walls, closed blinds, partially drawn screens already active, displaying documents, timelines, figures arranged with the same clean precision he expected from his team. And inside the room, Olivia Grant stood near the head of the table alongside two legal advisors, both unfamiliar to him, which in itself was a signal, because unfamiliar meant external and external meant this had moved beyond internal containment. Ethan, you are here, she said, and her voice held no relief, no tension, just acknowledgement, and he nodded once, stepping forward, taking his place without hesitation, because hesitation would only create space, and space was not something he could afford now. The first document appeared on the screen as soon as he sat down, not introduced, not explained, just presented, and Ethan recognized it immediately, a summary of disclosures tied to his divorce settlement, organized in a way he had not seen before, simplified, stripped down to essential points, and next to it a second column marked with discrepancies highlighted in quiet but unmistakable detail, amounts, dates, accounts that had not been included in the original filings. And as he looked at it, the structure became clear, not chaotic, not exaggerated, but methodical, each piece placed exactly where it needed to be to tell a story that did not rely on interpretation. We have reviewed the preliminary data, Olivia said, and her tone remained steady, but there was a precision to it now, sharper, more defined. The issue is not just what was omitted, it is how consistently those omissions align with advisory decisions made at the time. Ethan leaned forward slightly, not in defense, not yet, but in focus, because this was no longer about isolated errors, this was about patterns, and patterns were harder to dismiss because they suggested intention. Whether that intention belonged to him or not was the question that now mattered. Were those accounts under my direct authorization, he asked, and one of the legal advisors responded immediately. Some were, others were structured through delegated authority, but all fall within the scope of your financial representation during the settlement. And the phrase financial representation carried more weight than the numbers on the screen, because representation implied responsibility, not absolute, not immediate, but present, enough to require explanation. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze moving across the data again, not searching for a way out, but for clarity, because clarity was the only thing that would allow him to move forward without reacting blindly. And Lily Carter's position, he asked, not looking up this time, just letting the name settle into the room. And there was a brief pause, not long but enough to acknowledge that this was no longer just a financial review, it was also personal. She has filed for formal reassessment, supported by new documentation and representation, Olivia said, and this time her tone shifted slightly, not softer but more direct. This will move forward regardless of our internal conclusions. Ethan nodded once, a small controlled motion, and leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, just recalibrating, because the situation in front of him was no longer something he could manage with assumption or influence. It required something else, something he had not needed in a long time: full accountability to facts he had not fully examined before. And as the room remained quiet, as the screens continued to display numbers that no longer felt distant, Ethan Cole understood something that would define everything that followed. Not all consequences arrive with force, some arrive with clarity, and once they do, there is no version of the past that can remain unchanged. The room did not move after the last sentence. It held still, as if every person inside understood that something irreversible had just been acknowledged, not declared, not dramatized, but recognized in a way that carried more weight than any argument ever could. Ethan did not speak immediately. He let the silence settle, not as avoidance but as alignment, because the facts in front of him no longer required reaction, they required acceptance, and acceptance was not something he had built his life around, it was something he had bypassed with efficiency, with delegation, with trust placed in systems that now stood under review. His gaze moved once more across the screen, not searching for errors, not questioning the structure, but tracing the pattern that had already formed, a pattern that connected decisions made in conference rooms, signatures placed without hesitation, and outcomes that had seemed final at the time, but now stood open again, examined from a perspective he had not considered, or perhaps had chosen not to consider. Olivia shifted slightly beside him, not interrupting, not pressing, just present, waiting for the moment when he would move forward, because this was no longer about whether something had happened, it was about how it would be addressed. The next phase is not optional, she said quietly, and her tone carried no urgency, because urgency was no longer necessary. The review will proceed, and any response we make will need to align with documented facts, not assumptions. Ethan nodded once, a small controlled motion, but this time it was different. It was not acknowledgement of information, it was acknowledgement of position, because for the first time since this began, he was no longer evaluating the situation from outside it, he was inside it fully, and there was no distance left between him and the consequences that would follow. What is the expected outcome? He asked, not as a challenge, not as a negotiation, just as a question grounded in reality, and one of the legal advisors responded with the same measured clarity that had defined the entire meeting. It depends on the findings, but potential outcomes include financial restitution, revised settlements, and formal accountability measures. And each word was precise, not exaggerated, not softened, just clear enough to remove any ambiguity. And Ethan absorbed it, not reacting, not resisting, just understanding, because understanding was the only step left before action, and action now required something he had not exercised in this way before: direct ownership without deflection. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting still on the table, his posture unchanged, but the meaning behind it no longer the same, because control in this moment did not come from directing others, it came from choosing how to stand within the truth that had already surfaced. And we proceed with full transparency, he said, and the words were not loud, not forceful, but they carried something new, something grounded not in authority, but in decision. And Olivia watched him for a brief second before nodding once, not in agreement but in recognition. Because this was the first moment he had aligned himself with the reality in front of him, instead of trying to reshape it. The screens remained active, the data unchanged, the room still contained within glass walls overlooking a city that continued without interruption, and yet inside that space something had shifted completely, not in structure, not in appearance, but in direction, because from this point forward nothing would be managed quietly, nothing would be assumed, resolved without examination. And as the meeting continued, moving into next steps, timelines, responsibilities, Ethan Cole sat at the center of it, not as the man who controlled the outcome, but as the one who would now be defined by how he faced it. And that distinction, once invisible, now stood as the only thing that mattered. The days that followed did not unfold with chaos or spectacle, they moved with a quiet precision that felt almost indifferent to The weight of what was happening. Reports were filed, meetings extended, timelines enforced not by urgency but by inevitability, and Ethan Cole moved through each of them with the same controlled presence he had always carried, except now that control was no longer about direction, it was about endurance, about standing still long enough for everything to surface without stepping away from it. Financial adjustments were made, not quietly but formally, settlements recalculated, disclosures corrected, and every document that had once been signed with certainty was now reviewed with a level of scrutiny that left no space for assumption, and through it all Ethan did not resist, he did not deflect, he did not attempt to reframe what had already been established, because somewhere between that night in the restaurant and the moment he chose transparency, he had understood something that could not be undone. Some outcomes are not punishments, they are corrections, and corrections do not respond to denial. They respond to acknowledgement. Weeks later the process reached its conclusion, not with a single moment, but with a series of confirmations, documents finalized, agreements signed, and responsibility assigned in clear, structured terms. And when it was over, when the last review closed, and the final report was delivered, Ethan sat alone in his office again, the same room, the same view, the same city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, but everything within that frame felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, and that distinction mattered more than anything that had been taken or returned. His phone rested on the desk beside him, silent for once, no immediate demands, no incoming updates, just stillness, and in that stillness his thoughts did not return to the numbers or the negotiations, they returned to a single image, a quiet restaurant, soft lighting, a woman in a simple uniform standing with a certainty that did not ask for recognition, and he realized then that what had shifted that night was not just his situation, it was his understanding of what he had lost. Long before any document was reviewed, Lily Carter had moved forward, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something far more difficult, clarity and distance, and in doing so she had left behind a version of their story that no longer required his presence to exist. He stood slowly from his chair, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, and walked toward the glass window once more, looking out at the city that continued without pause, people moving, lives unfolding, decisions being made every second without waiting for resolution, and for the first time in a long time he did not see it as something to control or shape, he saw it as something he was part of, not above, not separate, but within, and that understanding settled quietly, without demand, without announcement, because real change rarely declares itself, it simply replaces what was there before without asking permission. Somewhere across the city, in a smaller, quieter space, Lily continued her own life, not defined by what had been corrected, not measured by what had been returned, but grounded in something far more stable, her own direction, her own decisions, her own future. And she did not look back, not because she could not, but because she no longer needed to, and Ethan, standing there, understood that more clearly than anything else. Not every loss is meant to be recovered, some are meant to be understood. And in that understanding something else begins, not redemption, not reversal, just clarity. And sometimes clarity is the only thing that remains when everything else has been stripped away, leaving behind a truth that does not need to be spoken to be fully known.